Geraldo Rivera and Brian Kilmeade are going to discuss the Ukraine on Fox News because who knows the Ukraine better than Brian Kilmeade, I always say. So let's listen, and then I'm going to rage out a little bit.
So we have the Ukraine president saying they've reached a truce after days of deadly violence. So what's your take on the White House's response? Is it good enough? Should we be doing more?
Well, you know, Elizabeth, it's a really tough situation. Having lived through Libya, where we removed Gaddafi and replaced him with people who are much more troublesome, much more dangerous, much more erratic, much more unstable, I think the United States is well advised to keep out of these conflicts to the extent we can. Ukraine is another one of those examples. It's a country of 46 million people. It's nestled right between, or wedged, I should say, right between Russia to the east and Europe and the United States to the west. The country itself is divided. You have ethnic Russians on the eastern side. You have ethnic Ukrainians on the western side. I don't know what the heck the United States can do other than what they are doing. You have Angela Merkel now, the German chancellor, the most powerful woman in Europe, the most powerful person in Europe. She's negotiating with her Russian counterparts, trying to get them to cool it, trying to get these two sides to just sit down. I think that the Ukraine president, it's pretty clear that Ukraine's president is going to go, that nobody wants him anymore. Right. But what the United States can do is very, very limited. It's not like the old Cold War with the threat of nuclear apocalypse. We have to convince Putin that it's in his interest to cool things down.
It'll never be
we
in
want
his
to influence
interest.
the Ukrainians to tilt.
Well, you know, it'll never be in his interest. His interest is doing what he did, providing millions of dollars to walk away from a deal with the EU. This guy is a puppet for them. We have an obligation to provide an outlet for freedom in that area. I'm not talking about troops, but we tell the Secretary of Defense.
What are you talking about then, Brian?
Tell the Secretary of Defense to keep their troops home and allow the people to speak. This is an industrialized country. This is not Libya.
Brian, how do you do it? Without sending in the 82nd Airborne or the 101st Airborne? How does the United States do exactly what you're suggesting?
There's plenty of things we can do behind the scenes.
So let me break this down for you. First of all, as we just discussed in the last segment and as we discussed yesterday, here's the situation in a nutshell in the Ukraine. The government rejected an EU deal at the last minute. It would have made the Ukraine more Western, more open, less authoritarian. It would have opened trade, etc. So pro-European protesters took to the streets, and then the government ended up taking a bailout from Russia, and they affirmed a deal with them. They chose to stick with the old Soviet bloc and Vladimir Putin. So the country is divided between dealing more with Russia or dealing more with the EU. The eastern part of the country wants to continue to deal with Russia. The rest of them want to deal with the EU from now on and become more Western. So the protesters were peaceful, but the riot police killed 70 of them and injured hundreds more. So in steps Brian Kilmeade, who wants the U.S. to intervene. Why? Okay, the government just agreed to early elections, and they got a truce and a peace deal with the protesters. I've gotten to the point now where I flat out hate interventionists. All these people who believe in American imperialism and think we should be the world police, I mean, that's just flat out idiotic. If you intervene in the Ukraine, then you also have to intervene anywhere else in the world where there's problems. And there's a lot of places in the world that actually have worse problems than the Ukraine. For example, Zimbabwe, the Congo, where they're on the verge of genocide, if not already engaged in religious genocide. You'd have to go into Syria, where at this point, hundreds of thousands of people have died and probably millions displaced. You have to go into Saudi Arabia, where there's a Muslim theocracy and women have no rights whatsoever. You'd have to go into Mali. Northern Mali is basically Al-Qaeda-stan. Okay, we'd have to go into Myanmar, another military junta and a dictatorship. North Korea, of course, that lunatic. And there's 30 other countries that we'd have to go into that have worse issues. But see, these guys, they're hypocrites. So they just pick and choose. They pick and choose. Whatever's in the news today that I read a headline about, you know, sitting in my comfy studio, sipping on some coffee, I'll say, we got to go there. We got to go there because I read 3 lines of an article that made me feel uncomfortable, so I think we got to go in there. Really? Would you be comfortable with sending your son or daughter into that place to fight for people, for an issue they don't understand, for an end that we don't understand either? Is that what you want to do? I mean, again, it's just, it's so toddler-like in the way they approach it. And by the way, usually when we do intervene in places, specifically militarily, what happens? We waste trillions of dollars. The American public turns against it immediately. We end up supporting dictators over democracy because the dictators will help out our corporations more. You know, dictators like Batista and Pinochet and Marcos and Mobutu and Salazar and Franco and all these crazy authoritarian regimes that we supported while we pretended like we were on the side of democracy. So no, here's the answer. Here's what you do. You stay the fuck out of it. Because even if you intervene also, you're escalating a new Cold War thing because Russia would be pissed if we got intervened. That's a bad thing. So here's what you do. You stay out of it, and you hope that the protesters eventually get their way and the Ukraine becomes more European-affiliated and Western-affiliated instead of being Russia-affiliated. But guess what? Even if it turns out that they are more Russia-affiliated, or if they have to split the country in two when one side goes Russia-affiliated, the other side goes EU-affiliated, still none of our business.